Hello. Thank you for joining me today. We will be looking at another video. Once again, we'll be looking at a Senate hearing where Senator Rand Paul is questioning Dr. Anthony Fauci. And chances are you may have come across this in the news or in social networking. And there's a very, very good possibility that if you did not come across this video on YouTube, then you were exposed to a small section of this exchange. Perhaps what you saw was just a few seconds of this video, or maybe even a screen capture of this entire exchange, and a narrative was pushed to lean your opinion in one direction or the other, a lot of it having to do with which side of the politics was involved in doing it. And most of the time, this happens on Twitter, because Twitter is geared towards brevity and speed. As soon as you get into the details, you notice that you're able to get into more nuance, you're able to get into more understanding, and you get to hear both sides of the story. You're able to see both sides of the picture. Having said that, let's listen and watch this exchange between Senator Rand Paul and Dr. Anthony Fauci, and thereafter I'll give you some of my observations.
But she's had the flu for 14 days. Should she get a flu shot?
Well, no. If she got the flu for 14 days, she's as protected as anybody can be, because the best vaccination is to get infected yourself.
And
So
she should not get it?
if she really has the flu, she definitely doesn't need a flu vaccine. If she really has the flu,
She should not get it again?
no, she doesn't need it, because it's the most potent vaccination is getting infected yourself.
This is an ongoing question, and we've had ever-evolving opinions from you, Dr. Fauci. Currently, antibody surveys show that 80% of children, approximately 80% of children, have had COVID, and yet there are no guidelines coming from you or anybody in the government to take into account their naturally acquired immunity. You seemed quite certain of yourself in 2004, but in 2022, there's a lot less certainty. One of the things that we also know after looking at this for 2 to 3 years is that the mortality from COVID is very similar, if not less, than influenza. So when we look at this, we wonder, why you seem to really embrace basic immunology back in 2004 and why you seem to reject it now.
Well, I don't reject basic immunology, Senator. And I have never denied that there is importance of the protection following infection. However, as we have said many times, and as has been validated by the authorization by the FDA through their committee and the recommendation by the CDC through their committee, that a vaccination following infection gives an added extra boost. And that film that you showed is really taken out of context. I believe that was when someone called in who had had a reaction to a vaccine and asked me through a telephone in the interview if they should get vaccinated again. So it was in the context of someone who had a reaction. And as a matter of fact, Reuters fact check looked at that and said, Fauci's 2004 comments do not contradict his pandemic stance.
Actually, words don't lie. If you look at the words behind me, we can go over them a little bit at a time. She doesn't need it because the most potent vaccination is getting infected yourself.
It is true. It is true, Senator. It is a very potent way to protect.
So when you're trying to tell us that kids need a third or a fourth vaccine, are you including the variability or the variable of previous infection in the studies? No, you're not. Because when you have approved vaccines in recent times, and the committees that have approved it for children don't report anything on hospitalization or death or transmission. They only report that if you give them the jab, they'll make antibodies. And you can give kids hundreds of jabs and they'll make antibodies every time, but that does not prove efficacy. So what you're doing is denying the very fundamental premise of immunology that previous infection does provide some sort of immunity. It's not in any of your studies. Almost none of your studies from the CDC or from the government have the variable of whether or not you've been previously infected. So let's look at adults. I've had 3 infections. Should I get a 4th one? If you're going to measure whether I get a 4th one, you need a category that has a 4th one in it, and you need one that has nothing in it, no vaccine or the 4th vaccine. But you also need to know whether they've been infected. If you ignore whether they've been infected, you're ignoring a vaccine, basically, so you're ignoring a variable. So what you're giving us is this, you decry, and people decry vaccine hesitancy. It's coming from the gobbledygook that you give us. You're not paying attention to the science. The very basic science is that previous infection provides a level of immunity. If you ignore that in your studies, if you don't present that in your committees, you're not being truthful or honest with us.
Senator, if I might respond, I have never, ever denied fundamental immunology. In fact, I wrote the chapter in the textbook of medicine
Is it
on fundamental
any of the guidelines,
immunology.
any of the guidelines for vaccines?
You know,
do any of the guidelines for vaccines from the government include previous infection as something to base your decision making on with vaccines? Do any of the guidelines involve previous infection? That's why you're ignoring previous infection, because it doesn't involve any of the guidelines. And furthermore, we've been asking you, and you refuse to answer, whether anybody on the vaccine committees gets royalties from the pharmaceutical companies. I asked you last time, and what was your response? We don't have to tell you.
Right.
We've demanded them through Freedom of Information Act, and what have you said? We're not going to tell you. But I tell you this, when we get in charge, we're going to change the rules, and you will have to divulge where you get your royalties from what companies, and if anybody in the committee has a conflict of interest, we're going to learn about it. I promise you that.
Mr. Chair, can I respond to that, please?
May.
Okay, there are 2 aspects for what you said. You keep saying you approve, you do this, you do that. The committees that give the approval are FDA through their advisory committee. The committees that recommend are CDC through their advisory committee. And you keep saying, I'm the one that's approving a vaccine based on certain data. So I don't really understand, with all due respect, Senator.
You're the one that said you would not reveal what companies gave you royalties or what company gave the other scientists royalties.
Gotta move
That's
on.
what you told the committee.
Senator Paul,
Sir,
you gotta move on.
Could I please answer that?
Briefly,
You
yes.
keep asking committees. They're not my committees. They're the VRPAC committee for the FDA and the ACIP for the CDC. So I don't have any idea what goes on
And they
with
won't
the...
reveal, as well as you won't reveal
Okay,
what
we're
companies
gonna
you got.
move on. We're over time. Senator Paul, you're over. Everyone is over a little bit. I just want to make sure we keep on time here. For the record, I know Chair Murray and previous chairs of this committee of both parties have found videos to be out of order, and I will note for the record the video is out of order. We'll move to Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr.
Hello. I do hope you're one of those people who has the patience to have seen through the entire video. If you are one of the better individuals when it comes to concentration. Because there seems to be a whole section of the population today that can concentrate on videos only as long as, at the most, a couple of minutes. So now that you've made it this far, we are going to address the question, was that the right way to ask questions? Or, as the title of this video is, the lost art of asking questions. And additionally, it says, and being burdened by presupposed answers. So, Senator Rand Paul sets the stage with a video that is taken out of context at the time when the editing was done. Do you think that Senator Rand Paul was aware of what he is deciding to leave out and what he is deciding to focus on? I'm very sure he understood what he's doing. Having said that, he did make a good point, and that was, is the repetitive infection in children and others also taken into consideration when recommendations are being made for being vaccinated for COVID-19? And I don't have to repeat the replies that Dr. Anthony Fauci gave him, but I will notice this, that Senator Rand Paul, by the way he frames the question, and on every single occasion that I have seen, interrupts Dr. Anthony Fauci in the middle of his answer, as if he's triggered by every point when Dr. Fauci goes against what is in Senator Paul's mind. That is not the trait of a good investigator. And a lot of people do this, a lot. But someone who is mature in asking questions is seeking not the answer he has in mind. He is seeking an answer. The possibility that the answer would be exactly as someone has in mind is made even more remote when you consider the difference in knowledge and medical understanding and experience between Senator Rand Paul and Dr. Anthony Fauci. So Dr. Fauci, if you have looked into his history, if you have heard his lectures, witnessed his interviews, and if you have had the opportunity to be in close association with him, then you would know that he is at the senior-most position he is at from where he's going to retire. And a person doesn't get there by accident. You have to have a number of qualities and, of course, the support of a lot of people to get to that position. But I am not making an argument from his authority or for his authority. He is being questioned by someone who is inferior to him in this regard, in the regard of medical understanding, in the regard of how comprehensive the knowledge is. And evidently, from this exchange and a few others in the past, Dr. Anthony Fauci also exceeds Senator Rand Paul in character, because I cannot recall an occasion when Dr. Anthony Fauci interrupted Senator Rand Paul while he was asking the question. But I can, on the tips of my fingers, count a number of times when Senator Paul interrupts Dr. Anthony Fauci. And that reveals something about both gentlemen. I'm sure Senator Paul can learn a few things, even in this regard, from Dr. Anthony Fauci. Now, I'll just say this, that Dr. Anthony Fauci, when he was questioned about the natural immunity, he decided to tread the fine line of agreeing with Senator Rand Paul on the role of natural immunity, and he said he does not deny basic immunology. But where he was disagreeing with Senator Paul is that the video that he showed, the section, he cut out the portion where it was the question asked by someone over the phone who had suffered an adverse reaction to the flu vaccine. And keeping that in mind, Dr. Anthony Fauci was giving his reply. And even then, I remember Senator Rand Paul has accused Dr. Anthony Fauci of parsing words. But he was accusing Dr. Fauci of something he himself was doing. Senator Rand Paul was parsing words. And when he was parsing words, he took one statement out of the 3 or 4 sentences and focused only on that. Do you consider that to be a good way of looking at evidence? Do you consider it a good way to look at evidence by disregarding the context and only focusing in or zeroing in on a statement that suits your presupposition? It is not. That would rarely be the case where you need to do that. And it is helpful to do that. There are chances, there are examples when that happens. This is not an example of that. Now, another thing in the interview, I'm sure you would have noticed, but if you have not, then I'd like to highlight that one more time. That Senator Paul is wrongly attributing to Dr. Fauci the results of actions that Dr. Fauci alone is not capable of or authorized to take. When decisions are made at the institutional level by the FDA or the CDC, Dr. Fauci himself is taking recommendations and results of studies that have been gone over by committees working in those agencies. That shows a lack of understanding on the part of Senator Rand Paul of how the FDA and the CDC works. Now, I understand in a Senate hearing, every senator is given only so much time, and it could have been that Senator Rand Paul could have done his homework before questioning Dr. Anthony Fauci, so he would not have needed to clarify the chain of command and how the FDA and the CDC work. I, as a viewer, in just those few minutes, could understand what Dr. Anthony Fauci was saying. But the other thing that comes to the fore is that Senator Rand Paul is targeting Dr. Fauci And this act of targeting him is politically motivated. Is this an assumption on my part? It is absolutely not an assumption. Because following these Senate hearings, Senator Rand Paul goes on to Fox News and again pushes a narrative which is eagerly welcomed by Fox News and the viewers of Fox News, because already a determination has been made to be anti-Dr. Anthony Fauci. How that happened is another matter, but it is a phenomenon to be noticed. Is that science-based? Is it evidence-based? Hardly. If there was a scientific basis, or there was incriminating evidence against Dr. Fauci, it would be understood if not only Senator Paul but other senators had that evidence before them, and they were confronting Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is in denial of what is already proven. But the position from which Dr. Rand Paul, or Senator Rand Paul, approaches Dr. Fauci is that Dr. Fauci is already proven guilty. He is coming from that assumption. And that assumption is supported by his political stance and by the kind of following he has. Does that happen on the other side of politics? To people who are in the Democratic Party, among the Democrats? Do they do that towards Republicans? I'm sure it happens. There must be plenty of evidence of that happening too. But just looking at this one particular case, this is an observation that can be made. Once again, going back to the media appearances of Senator Rand Paul and Dr. Anthony Fauci following or preceding these Senate hearings, what does Senator Paul do right after these Senate hearings? He promotes himself and puts Dr. Anthony Fauci down. And he promotes the narrative that is against Dr. Anthony Fauci. On the other hand, have you noticed what Dr. Fauci does and the kinds of interviews he participates in, the questions he answers? To my knowledge, he continues to focus on the work that is assigned to him. He is involved in the work of the FDA, the CDC, in giving direction to viewers, and he himself states the recommendations of the FDA or the NIH or the CDC as the authority. Why does he do that? He does that because he understands and he humbly appreciates the work that is done by teams of doctors and scientists who could very well exceed his own abilities, but they happen to be working under Dr. Anthony Fauci in the institutional hierarchy. But when the results come from this research or from these findings and recommendations have to be made, Dr. Fauci states them as the authority. He states the FDA or the CDC as the authority. And because he is the mouthpiece who comes before the questions from the media, people assume that he is the FDA. He is the CDC. But he has clarified a few times that he is not the FDA. He is not the CDC. The day he retires from the FDA or the CDC or the NIAID, those institutions will continue to function just as they've always done. Thousands upon thousands of doctors and scientists and employees will continue to work exactly as they have been doing for years or decades. And after he retires, sometime after that, it would seem as if this man is missed for some reasons. But as the institutions continue to do their functions, it will become amply clear that these institutions do not depend on Dr. Fauci. Rather, Dr. Fauci is just one of many people who depended on these institutions. So all these lessons we can learn, these are my observations. But as far as the original question, or the original statement about the lost art of asking questions, perhaps it would be good for you to look at a few of the interviews where Dr. Anthony Fauci is being interviewed by a colleague or some other doctor or doctors. And they ask a question and they sit back and listen to what he has to say. They withhold any agreement or disagreement, and they just listen to what he has to say, and then they move on to the next question. Those ladies and gentlemen are far more skilled in the asking of questions and accepting answers. And it's very possible that they are not burdened by any kind of assumptions or presuppositions. But even if they are, it is a common courtesy to ask a question and be quiet to let the other person express himself. A lot of us make the mistake of asking questions and then not listening for the answer or expecting answers as we want them to be. So if from this exchange and this video we can get this lesson about regaining or rediscovering that art of asking questions, let's do it. Let us do it because we see what not to do, and we also see what we could do. I want to thank you very much again for your company, for your time, for your attention, and I will be back with another video at a later time. I don't know exactly when, sooner or later, but I'm very positive I'll have a subject that I'll be able to incorporate in a video. So thank you very much. I'll see you at another time. Goodbye and take care.